Tonight on Bridge City News, reaction from the powerful testimony former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould gave in Ottawa yesterday continues. Sexually transmitted diseases are on the rise in Alberta. BCN's Loris Alexander has a special two-part feature focusing on why the numbers are rising. And Black History Month continues. Today we chat with a historian about a famous black cowboy who had a major influence in Alberta. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. In a bombshell on Parliament Hill yesterday, former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould told the Commons Justice Committee that she was pressured to halt a criminal prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. She says she also received threats.
For a period of approximately 4 months between September and December of 2018, I experienced a consistent and sustained effort by many people within the government to seek to politically interfere in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in my role as the Attorney General of Canada in an inappropriate effort to secure a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin. These events involved 11 people, excluding myself and my political staff, from the Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council office, and the Office of the Minister of Finance. This included in-person conversations, telephone calls, emails, and text messages. There were approximately 10 phone calls and 10 meetings specifically about SNC, and I and/or my staff were a part of these meetings.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he completely disagreed with what former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould had to say before the Justice Committee.
I strongly maintain, as I have from the beginning, that I and my staff always acted appropriately and professionally. I therefore completely disagree with the former Attorney General's characterization of events. Our government will always focus on jobs and our economy. We, of course, had discussions about the potential loss of 9,000 jobs in communities across the country, including the possible impact on pensions. My job as Prime Minister has always been to stand up for Canadians and Canadian workers.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer says the Prime Minister should resign, while NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is demanding a public inquiry following Wilson-Raybould's damaging testimony on the SNC-Lavalin affair.
Justin Trudeau simply cannot continue to govern this country now that Canadians know what he has done. And that is why I am calling on Mr. Trudeau to do the right thing and to resign. Further, the RCMP must immediately open an investigation, if it has not already done so, into the numerous examples of obstruction of justice the former Attorney General detailed in her testimony.
This all points to a government, and a Liberal government and Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, who are more interested in helping their powerful friends than they're helping everyday Canadians who are struggling with housing, the cost of medication, the cost of living. This is unprecedented testimony that bolsters our argument and our call for a public inquiry. At this point, Canadians demand some answers to the questions that they have, and the only way to get to the bottom of this is a public inquiry that would have independence to assess the truth.
Canadians are definitely looking for answers, but will we find them? Joining me now is political columnist with the Sun newspaper, Brian Lilly. Brian, should a criminal investigation be launched into the Trudeau Liberals and their involvement with the SNC-Lavalin affair?
After the testimony that she laid out in great detail, Hal, I don't see how the RCMP cannot be investigating this. We've had innuendo, we've had anonymous sources. Yesterday, we had the woman at the center of this show up at a parliamentary committee. She had emails, she had text messages, she had quotes from people, including the Prime Minister, inferring that, you've got to consider cutting the deal with SNC-Lavalin because of the Quebec election. And, by the way, I'm the MP from Papineau. That's going beyond what's acceptable. As Ms. Wilson-Raybould said, it was acceptable for the Prime Minister to talk to her about jobs, especially in the early going, but not to talk to her about political considerations, because that is political interference in a criminal prosecution. The criminal code, section 139, says that you don't have to accomplish it, because if you remember, she said it wasn't illegal. I'm going to disagree with her. She said it wasn't illegal because they didn't convince her to change her mind. But the criminal code just says you have to willfully attempt to obstruct the course of justice. And there were several meetings, several phone calls, intense pressure put on this woman to change her mind, and it did not happen. That's the good news. The bad news is the Prime Minister and his office were trying to do it. They need to be investigated. It has to be a police investigation. This is well beyond the Ethics Commissioner now.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer is calling on the Prime Minister to resign because Justin Trudeau has lost his moral authority to lead. Your thoughts?
You could say if you're going to be under a police investigation, then you've got to resign. Well, that obviously isn't working south of the border in the United States, where Donald Trump is facing a quasi-police type investigation. The Prime Minister may have lost the confidence of most members of the House. I'm sure on any given day, the NDP and the Conservatives would vote him down, but have Liberal members lost confidence? And unless they have, they won't vote him out. I don't see Justin Trudeau stepping down from the job that he feels he was destined to hold. So I think it's going to have to wait until October. I do think that the police need to get involved, and that's why I'm calling for that rather than waiting for what I don't think will happen, which is the Prime Minister resigning. But it's very difficult when you consider that Jody Wilson-Raybould, until recently, sat at the cabinet table with them. She's still a member of the Liberal caucus, and she came out with that damning evidence against him. I don't know how Justin Trudeau recovers from this. He was already losing support before we had all the details. Now I think it's going to just escalate.
Well, it should be interesting to see how this plays out and how Canadians will vote in the federal election this fall. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A day after scathing public testimony during which he called U.S. President Donald Trump a racist and a con man, the president's former attorney, Michael Cohen, was back on Capitol Hill today. This time, however, to talk behind closed doors to the White House Intelligence Committee. Cohen is due to begin a 3-year prison sentence in May. He described himself as cooperative with multiple investigations in the hopes of reducing his time behind bars. U.S. President Donald Trump, meanwhile, described the testimony from Michael Cohen as a fake hearing. He was also not impressed that it was held while he was in meetings with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
But I think having a fake hearing like that and having it in the middle of this very important summit is really a terrible thing. They could have made it 2 days later or next week, and it would have been even better. They would have had more time. But having it during this very important summit is sort of incredible. And he lied a lot, but it was very interesting because he didn't lie about one thing. He said no collusion with the Russian hoax. And I said, I wonder why he didn't just lie about that too, like he did about everything else. I mean, he lied about so many different things, and I was actually impressed that he didn't say, well, I think there was collusion for this reason or that. He didn't say that. He said no collusion, and I was a little impressed by that, frankly. He could have gone all out. He only went about 95% instead of 100%.
Closer to home, Alberta Finance Minister Joe Ceci gave a third-quarter update yesterday, and it appears as though our budget deficit is $2 billion lower than previously forecast. A big reason is the higher-than-expected bitumen royalties. Ceci projected a deficit of $6.9 billion for the 2018-2019 fiscal year, down from the $8.8 billion in last March financial blueprint. Ceci says the budget will be balanced by the year 2023, saying Alberta will have one of the best balance sheets in the country. By the way, our provincial debt is almost $57 billion and is projected to rise to $95 billion by the year 2024. The Momo Challenge is a hoax internet challenge that targets kids online. A scary-looking figure appears and encourages kids to harm themselves. The RCMP wants to remind parents to be wary of internet dangers.
The internet is open to a bunch of strangers, and you're allowing strangers to come into your home through your internet devices. So you wouldn't allow a stranger to come through your front door, but you're allowing your children to allow people to come into their lives through their internet devices. So I think parents have to understand that there is a potential for danger. And I think parents need to monitor their children's use of any type of internet device. It's a great idea for the parents to understand some of the new apps that are coming out, to understand the language of computer talk, and to have good communication with their kids.
According to the O'Brien Institute of Public Health, the leading causes of childhood death in Canada are preventable accidents and suicides. Universal childcare programs are seen by many as a solution for working parents. The think tank Cardis just released a policy paper entitled A Positive Vision for Childcare Policy in Canada. Program manager Andrea Morozic says when it comes to childcare, there are different needs in both rural and urban settings.
Well, you raise a good point with that, which is the fact that it is a very local issue and that people who are working on a farm, for example, in a rural community will have different needs than in a city. Even within the city, however, we see different needs. You have a nurse, for example, doing shift work. You have people who are working in a mall. And so whether it's urban or rural, what we see is a diversity of needs that generally are not met by the type of care that governments are able to produce.
Catch my full interview with Andrea Morozic from Cardis coming up after business news. Sexually transmitted diseases are on the rise in Alberta. Shocking statistics show STIs have more than doubled since 2011. Health officials say the uptick is due in part to the rise in popularity of dating apps. BCN's Loris Alexander shows us why the province continues to struggle with these staggering numbers.
You know, for any one of us where we've had any type of, contact, it's always important for us to take care of our health, our sexual health, and our health in general. So, seeking that type of medical attention, to be screened, to be tested is really important.
Many have tried it, social media hookup apps, but now Alberta Health Services says these types of dating apps are partly to blame for a short rise in sexually transmitted diseases.
There are a lot of reasons for a rise in numbers, and like I said, one of them might be that they're tested more and are aware more, but the other rise would be there's probably people who are having unprotected sex. That's how these things spread. So and there's a rise in the MSM population so men having sex with men. That is, as that number of people rise, there is transmission among men having sex with men.
What's scary is that some of the stories that we're seeing, some of the influences that are out there that people may be taking. I don't know if they're taking more chances. I think people did it in the classified ads before. That those were probably not as accessible as what we're seeing now with dating apps. But there's still precautions that people need to take, and knowing who they're meeting.
Social media apps like Tinder and Grindr, which users access to connect with nearby people, oftentimes complete strangers, is part of a nationwide trend.
I think the biggest thing that we can do is educate and support each other. And education comes from when we're very young about who the safe people are, who the trusted people are, being able to know the signs and the risks that may be out there, believing people when they're talking to you about what they've experienced, being able to call out people as bystanders, being engaged.
Aside from protection, education is key. The best way to protect yourself from catching an STI is abstinence, to wear protection, and to get tested regularly. For Bridge City News, I'm Loris Alexander.
Tomorrow, Loris Alexander will examine the consequences of not disclosing you have an STD. Today is the last day of Black History Month, and Lethbridge College was not going to finish the month without a celebration. Ainsley O'Reilly explains why the open house was important for both students and faculty members.
Ibrahim Toure is a professor at Lethbridge College and helped organize today's Black History Month celebration. He's also a father and wants the message that he gave his son to be spread around the country.
He's 12 years old. He asked me the same question, like, why Black history? Why celebrating Black history? It's more than just celebrating the accomplishments and contribution of Black people in development of Canada. Black History Month celebration also try to highlight the injustices that Black people are experiencing in Canada today.
Lethbridge College welcomes over 40 countries each year. Within those countries are thousands of languages and traditions.
I think it's very important for people to know that not all Blacks are from Africa, not all Blacks are from the Caribbean. We have Blacks that are Canadian born. I have two boys, they are born in Canada. And we have Blacks that are, from Africa like me, and we have Blacks that are from the Caribbean. So I think it's very important for people to know that there is diversity within the Black community.
It's really important to remember that everybody who's here belongs here, and that asking questions that don't offer inclusivity and offer people the chance to just speak about who they are rather than where they come from is really important.
Within the Black community, diversity is their biggest strength, and when talking to students and faculty members, they talked about some of the misconceptions surrounding their groups and cultures.
Noise making, like sometimes we speak loud, especially when we are in group or when we are in home. We play music. We are so loud when we talk. So, but the white people, they don't talk that much. So they are very conservative. Anywhere you see black people, you will know there are black people there.
But common misconceptions like, they come in, doing drugs. If you see someone with, if you see a guy with braids, you think he's automatically like a Rastafarian or something like that.
For Bridge City News, I'm Ainsley O'Reilly.
This is the end of Black History Month, but in the early 1900s, it was a new beginning for many black people from the southern states who came up to Alberta for a fresh start. Historian Michael Daw has the details.
Oklahoma and Kansas, they were new frontier areas. So a lot of black people moved to those two states thinking that perhaps they could get a new life and have a new start with everything. Unfortunately, there were problems. So by about 1907, 1908, some of them with some very negative discriminatory laws starting to be passed, they thought, well, this isn't working out very well. Maybe it will be better if we go up to Alberta and to Canada.
Catch my full interview with Alberta historian Michael Daw as he also talks about one of our province's most famous black cowboys. That's coming up in the second half of our show. The City of Lethbridge has come out with a winter weather reminder for residents. Officials are asking when shoveling your sidewalk and driveway to not put the snow on the roads. If a fire hydrant is nearby your property, clear off the snow so it'll be easier to see in an emergency. And if you need free sand, you can pick some up at two locations. You can either get the sand at the corner of 4th Avenue and 7th Street North or at the West Lethbridge Recycling Station at the top of Bridge Drive. Just bring along a pail and shovel. The city is also reminding motorists to never pass a snowplow or sand truck and to maintain a safe distance from the vehicle in front of you. Rising fuel costs, the carbon tax, and climate change are reasons why many people south of the border are purchasing electric vehicles. Jim Stile is co-owner of Go Electric, a company that resells used electric cars. He spoke at SACPA today, and he said the government needs to step in more and create less incentive to buy a gas-powered vehicle.
There's half a dozen countries in Europe that have stated that they will mandate all vehicles, new vehicles sold will be electric by 2030. And I feel the auto industry is going to actually need that kind of push. Another option that I can see coming is to penalize gas vehicles when you register them, so that you have a disincentive to own a gas vehicle, and for good reason, right? They pollute a lot more.
Stile says that for those who use their vehicles to travel long distances, you should still use a gas-powered vehicle and keep your electric vehicle for city driving only. He says it's due to the limited range of driving electric cars, especially during the cold months when the range is affected. The Russian River in the wine country north of San Francisco is expected to recede after reaching its highest level in 25 years. The river has swamped more than 2,000 homes.
We were sleeping in our house and the water came up in and it almost engulfed us, but we made it out.
They pulled us out the window, actually, the fire guys, yeah.
The big thing is when the water goes down, what's going to be left behind and what damage was there from all the water. That's going to be the big thing.
Normally it's 200 feet that way.
So it's right here now?
Yes.
Ice castles in New Hampshire have become a very popular attraction. They feature ice tunnels, caverns, and even a 97-foot slide that covers an acre of farmland. Have a look.
Inside these walls at 15-foot intervals, there's a series of 73 sprinkler heads that's all hooked up to a manifold. What we do basically is after we've done that, once it gets cold enough, we turn that water on. We've set up what we call icicle farms, which are basically like chain link racks that we spray water on to grow icicles. We harvest the icicles and then we place them around the sprinklers. Once we turn the sprinklers on, the water starts freezing to those icicles. The water eventually freezes and starts making them grow together. They get bigger and bigger and thicker and thicker. Once they're thick enough, we place another layer of icicles on top of that and another layer on top of that and basically grow the castle about 2 to 3 feet at a time. when it's nice and bright outside, you get this really great glacier blue, which is really cool because you don't really see this color of ice, anywhere except for, naturally formed glaciers or when something artificial like this is put up. It is massively popular. I think more than our founders would have ever imagined it to be. We're pretty much sold out every Friday and Saturday night.
An ice castle, what a great idea, and it looks like so much fun, doesn't it? We had another mild day in our city, but unfortunately, the colder temperatures are returning. Complete weather details are coming up. A mainly cloudy but mild day today. Tonight, periods of snow developing up to 4 centimeters with a low near -15. Tomorrow, more snow in the forecast and a high of -13. A high pressure system returns on Saturday, blowing out the clouds and the mercury dropping to -19. Sunday, mainly sunny with a high of -15. Monday, lots of blue sky, sunshine, and a high of -8. Tuesday, sunshine again with a high of -3. Wednesday, slightly cooler with a daytime high near -5 expected. Checking the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 3 degrees and an average low of -9. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1992 at 19 degrees, and the record low was -32 in 1962. Sunrise was at 7:17, sunset at 6:11. Let's have a look at how tomorrow is shaping up across the country now. Vancouver will be mainly sunny and a high of 5. Just a few clouds at Victoria tomorrow and a high of 5 as well. Calgary will have a mixture of sun and cloud and a high of -19. Slightly cooler and -21 for Edmonton tomorrow. Mainly sunny and -21 for Regina. Saskatoon will be partly cloudy and -23. Winnipeg will be mainly cloudy and -12 on Friday. In the central part of the country, Toronto will be mainly sunny and -1. Ottawa will have lots of sunshine and should see a high of -3. Montreal will be sunny and -5. In the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will be sunny and -2. Halifax, Nova Scotia will have a clear sky and +1. Charlottetown, PEI will be sunny and -5. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, expect a few clouds and a high of -6 on Friday. An advertising standards body says an advocacy group for dairy farmers decided to pull one of its new ads after complaints from the public. Viewers said that the ad was misleading. The print ad is part of the Dairy Farmers of Canada's Honest Canadian Dairy campaign. It shows a man standing in front of a pasture with the words, "There are 0 growth hormones in milk produced in Canada, like none." An organizer with the animal rights group Direct Action Everywhere Toronto suggests people submit their complaints to ad standards to say that milk contains a natural growth hormone. CIBC says its first quarter profit was down 11% from a year ago to $1.18 billion. Despite the decline, Canada's 5th largest lender has raised its quarterly payment to common shareholders by 4 cents to $1.40. The bank says earnings were hit by several items, including a $227 million payment to Air Canada to secure the bank's participation in the airline's new loyalty program. It also saw a double-digit drop in net income from Canadian personal and small business banking and capital markets. Air Canada has also brought American Express on board when it launches its new loyalty program next year. It signed a 10-year partnership agreement with American Express that will allow Amex membership rewards customers to transfer their points to the new Air Canada program. Air Canada also signed 10-year agreements with TD Bank and Visa. German-based automakers BMW and Daimler say they're working together on developing the automated driving technology expected to transform the industry. The multinational companies announced today that they're working on new driver assistance systems, automated driving, and automated parking. The partnership comes as automakers try to fend off competition from Uber and Waymo, which are also working on autonomous driving. BMW and Daimler also launched a joint venture in digital services such as car sharing, ride hailing, and ticketless parking. Now, here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, there's been a lot of reaction on Parliament Hill following the damaging testimony of former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer says Prime Minister Justin Trudeau should resign, and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says there needs to be a public inquiry into the SNC-Lavalin affair. There seems to be a real difference in childcare in both the rural and urban areas. Andrea Mrazek from the think tank Cardis has details next from Ottawa. But first, here's a look at what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. Dave McCann and the Firehearts are releasing their new album, Westbound Till Light, on Friday, March 1st at the Empress Theatre in Fort Macleod at 7:30 p.m. Come and hear their collection of songs about interesting North American folklore and one that features Frank Slide. Tickets are $25 and are available at McLeodEmpress.com or by calling 1-800-540-9229. Another musical event that you can come and enjoy is the Community Cabaret, featuring live performances by Hippodrome, Pocaholics, and Jigging with Roy on Saturday, March 2nd at 7 p.m. at the Italian Canadian Cultural Club. Tickets are $20 and are available by calling the Southern Alberta Community Living Association at 403-329-1525. Free Accessoride is available. For more information, visit communitycabaret.ca. It's the 15th annual Woods Homes Children's Benefit Gala, taking place Saturday, March 30th at 6 p.m. at the Coast Hotel, Lethbridge. This year's gala includes a delicious dinner, silent and live auctions, and live entertainment by the Chevelles. For tickets and sponsorship opportunities, contact Colleen Campbell by calling 403-317-1777 or visit woodshomes.ca. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
Universal childcare programs are seen by many as the answer to challenges faced by many working parents. But is it really the best solution? Today's guest may not really see it that way. Andrea Mrazek is the program director for the think tank Cardis, which has come out with a new policy paper entitled A Positive Vision for Childcare Policy Across Canada. Andrea, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thanks for having me.
Universal childcare programs are being promoted fairly heavily by various government bodies across the country. Now, they say it's really needed in order to help out single moms, working families. But let me first of all ask, which provinces currently have universal daycare available?
So there's only one province that has a so-called universal childcare system, and that's Quebec. They've had it since 1997, and it started at $5 a day, and the costs have increased from there. But that would be the only province, is the province of Quebec, to officially have this idea of a universal system.
So why don't we see more of it in other provinces, like here in Alberta or in Ontario where you are?
It's something that childcare activists have been fighting for probably 40 years. And I think we don't have it because parents don't actually want it. It tends to be the least popular choice. And I think somewhere deep down, politicians and the powers that be are aware that this isn't actually a popular thing with families. So that's part of the reason why we don't have it. It continues to linger in the background as an option, which is of grave concern to me. And that's why we put out this positive vision for childcare that hopefully will avoid the pitfalls of universalism.
Now, would it be better for the government to make a variety of options available for parents?
So ultimately, what we hope to see is an opening up of the childcare sector that would allow parents to make choices that they'd like to make. And that includes whether they'd like to have a parent stay home. A lot of parents will tag team with a spouse or with grandparents and family members. Other parents will use friends in the community, home daycares in the neighborhood close by. And ultimately, the surveys and polls are remarkably consistent in showing that center-based care, which is what the government puts on offer, is the least popular choice. So I can't emphasize that quite enough. But there are very many levers that the government has to offer families solutions and possibilities that are more equitable than just offering one type of care.
So Andrea, what would the different needs of childcare for a rural community be as compared to larger municipal centers?
Well, you raise a good point with that, which is the fact that it is a very local issue and that people who are working on a farm, for example, in a rural community will have different needs than in a city. Even within the city, however, we see different needs. You have nurse, for example, doing shift work. You have people who are working in a mall. And so whether it's urban or rural, what we see is a diversity of needs that generally are not met by the type of care that governments are able to produce.
Now, when we think of daycare, we usually assume that maybe it starts at the kindergarten age, but I'm seeing governments advocating for younger ages, like kids age 3 or 4. Does that present some unique challenges?
You're actually a bit late on that. I just went to a major conference here in Ottawa run by the government where they talked about the needs for childcare beginning at birth. And I don't know how they're defining childcare, but they'd like to see the spaces accessible from birth forward. So there really has been a movement to go younger and younger. Kindergarten generally starts age 4 or 5. Here in Ontario, you can have 3-year-olds also in kindergarten. And the movement on the political front is really to push childcare into the school system. So childcare activists are very happy to attach it to kindergarten and push the kindergarten age downwards. But what they want to see is not for 3 and 4-year-olds. What they'd like to see is a space available for 1-year-olds, so that when generally many women will take a year maternity leave, that there would be spaces available at 1 year of age, and that's the goal.
Now, some parents would prefer faith-based care centers, while others prefer more of a secular approach. Is that something governments would really consider and even accommodate?
I think their parents need to look to the public education system and examine in their province and their jurisdiction how accessible faith-based learning is for the primary school sector and grades 1 and up. And if you have choice in that sector, you may find you get choice in the childcare sector. I know Alberta and Edmonton in particular used to have diversity in their school system, but I think times are changing, and some faith-based schools are getting pushed out or getting told what they can or can't teach at risk of their funding, et cetera. So it's a dicey time, I think, and the problem I think with the government is it's one source of funding and it's one source of care, and it's unrealistic to expect that they would be able to embed tremendous diversity into that.
So what does the research specifically say about the quality of care in government-funded daycare?
It's very poor, actually. The research is on quality, first I should say, is difficult. We don't have real quality standards, and it's difficult to measure it consistently. Again, at the conference I just attended, many of the childcare community were saying we need to have a better way of measuring quality. When we do measure quality and we use things like the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, we find that the outcomes are actually very poor on a lot of measures. So child vocabulary in Quebec, for example, is neutral. Behavioral problems are worse, they're negative. And interestingly, they found that parenting practices were worse, and that's attributed to the fact that parents don't have as much time to spend with their children after they begin to use a childcare system such as the universal one offered in Quebec. So it's very discouraging, actually, to see that the quality is quite low.
So who's actually paying for the universal childcare in Quebec then? The taxpayers? And are they happy about it? They must be. I mean, it's been implemented since what, 97?
Well, I don't know that Quebec voters and citizens got too much of a choice. It was rushed in 1997, and that's maybe part of the problem with the quality, that it was done very ad hoc and poorly. Certainly some childcare activists would point to that. It's a very expensive program. There's one research study suggesting that it pays for itself and then some. I raise an eyebrow to that study because I think part of the reason why we don't replicate these programs across the country is because they are so expensive. And what we just talked about, the poor quality in Quebec, points to the fact that although the cost of that program has increased by something like 800%, and they're putting more and more money into it, the quality remains very low. And so what we understand from this is that to have a truly quality system that really does well by our children, we'd have to be spending even more, and that's not sustainable, to use a popular word.
So Andrea, if the government was to put the money directly into the hands of parents and let them choose how to use it for childcare, would there be enough money available to actually make a significant difference for parents?
Well, and this is I think this is where the debate should rest, and how much money is enough money, and how are we helping parents, and what are we doing to help parents truly raise their families. I firmly believe that money in a parent's pocket is going to be better spent, and that parents will then make reasonable choices based on what works for their family. But the dollar value is a significant discussion to have. How much will that be? I know I just learned a bit about Hungarian family policy, where they're giving extraordinarily high dollar values to parents. I don't see that coming to Canada anytime soon, but the question is a very valid one about how we support families and whether we actually make their lives easier or not. Of course, I firmly believe that a universal system only helps some and makes everyone's lives tougher in the end.
Now, one of your recommendations is to build on the very successful Canada Child Benefit and as well maybe simply lower taxes. Tell me more about that.
Right, so any number of different levers exist. If you're a more left-wing government, you might choose to give way more money to parents as a handout is the word that comes to mind, but just money to spend in their pockets. The tax cut option would be something that actually could work as well, where parents with children don't pay any taxes. I might advocate for that if we consider how high taxes are. That could be a way of helping families to ease their finances and the difficulties of raising children. In the report, Positive Vision for Childcare, we mentioned a number of other interim options that go between the sort of those types of extremes. Of course, you can decrease taxes incrementally also. It doesn't have to go from high taxes to no taxes.
So what kinds of daycare models are being used by other countries around the world? You mentioned Hungary earlier there. Now, are there any success stories that we can maybe learn from?
The thing with the development of childcare, we mostly are looking to OECD nations, which are Organization Economic Cooperation and Development nations, and many of them are in Europe, and European culture and tradition leads to a more centralized government approach, and they tend to have systems that are so-called universal systems. But even within that context, you see variance, and we need to make sure that if we lean at all in that direction, that we, for example, we look more to a country like Finland, where they have at least monies going to parents in the first 3 years of life. They also have the spaces available in center-based care, but they don't limit their family policy to center-based care. So if Canada is even going to dabble in the so-called universal world of childcare, one of our recommendations is to think Finland, not Sweden. In Sweden, they don't have those benefits for parents. They just have the system, and the outcomes for children are not very good.
Now, you also suggest the government's work on increasing the flexibility of parental leave. Let's talk more about that.
We're basically in favor of anything that increases flexibility and choice for families, understanding that each family is unique. So if there's any further flexibility that can be added into parental leave that would allow people to, for example, do a little bit of work while on leave, that kind of thing would offer, I think, greater options and ease family stress and strain. And thinking about lengths of maternity leave and how people can use it in different increments, all that sort of thing is a conversation that we may not be having enough of. So there are a lot of levers in family policy and a lot of good discussion to be had. And again, I think flexibility and choice are key.
So apparently in some provinces, there's a deliberate strangling of the private sector, which results in a decrease in spaces and choices. So perhaps some regulatory changes are needed?
Yeah, there's a group that popped up in Ontario as a result of the direct and deliberate strangling of that independent childcare sector. And so that group of home daycare providers decided to advocate for themselves and come together. It's almost incomprehensible why you would strangle that sector. Here in Ontario, where I live, it really did eradicate something like close to 80,000 spaces for children. And those were popular spaces that, the sort of neighborhood home daycare type environment. But at that particular political juncture, there was a real hostility to any kind of independent care. So it's important, I think, to keep those options open again.
Now, another recommendation being considered is changing the requirements to become a qualified early childhood educator. Can you explain that?
Well, we do have a labor shortage, particularly in the childcare sector. And I define childcare as the care of a child, no matter who does it. Oftentimes, people think exclusively of the professionals. When we get into the professional zone, we find a real shortage of people to offer the type of care that parents would want to use. So I think things can be done there to free up that sector, and that's something that the independent childcare providers of Ontario were really concerned about. and contributed that recommendation to the report. But it's hard to find good staff in childcares, and there's things we can do to ease the labor supply side there.
So looking ahead, what kind of changes do you realistically see taking place over the next few years?
I think realistically, we can stave off a universal approach. We can keep things in the hands of the provinces. We can keep it close to where parents are living. That would mean even going municipal. I think we can redefine childcare to mean the care of a child, no matter who does it. And that can include your family members or parents. Basically, I think there are realistic expectations around what it is that governments across the country can choose to do on this file. It is a highly, highly politicized issue, so it definitely depends what government comes into power in various provinces. But that push and pull is important in a democracy anyway.
Andrea Mrazek, Program Director for the think tank Cardis, thanks a lot for joining me today from Ottawa.
Thank you so much for having me.
February is Black History Month, and as it turns out, our province of Alberta has a rich history in that department. Joining me now via Skype from Red Deer is Michael Daw, a Red Deer City Councillor who served as a historian for many years. Welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you for having me.
So Michael, can you share some of your historical facts with our viewers? When did the first Black people immigrate to Alberta?
Well, the very earliest ones actually were part of the fur trade, so we're going back, hundreds of years ago. Unfortunately, a lot of those early Black fur traders aren't well documented. A lot of the more noticeable immigration started in the, I'd say, 1880s, 1890s. After the American Civil War, a lot of former slaves got new careers or occupations or jobs working as cowhands in the big cattle drives from Texas across Wyoming and the American Prairie West. And eventually some of those made their way up into Alberta. So actually one thing that I always found surprising is at one point it was estimated about 1 out of every 4 of the cowboys on the big cattle drives were Black.
Wow, we'll talk about more of that in just a moment here. Now, what was the connection with Oklahoma? Are there any stories behind that?
Well, what happened was that you had those very early people, a lot of them in cattle, or a few of them came up north as homesteaders. But again, after the American Civil War, a lot of them didn't wish to stay in the old slave states. They decided to go elsewhere. And Oklahoma and Kansas, they were new frontier areas. So a lot of Black people moved to those 2 states, thinking that perhaps they could get a new life and have a new start with everything. Unfortunately, there were problems. So by about 1907, 1908, some of them with some very negative discriminatory laws starting to be passed. They thought, well, this isn't working out very well. Maybe it will be better if we go up to Alberta and to Canada.
Were there any economic incentives as well for Black people to move to our province?
Well, one of the biggest ones is if they came up here, I mean, for those that had been in the cattle industry, there were jobs as cowhands or cowboys or taking care of horses. But they're just like anybody else, they had the ability to apply for homesteads in Alberta, which meant that they could get 180 acres of land, a quarter section for a $10 filing fee. And to get some good farmland and a future for a $10 filing fee was a pretty good incentive.
So Michael, what was the typical response from the mainly white European settlers? Were they welcoming, or was there a lot of discrimination going on at that time?
It was mixed. I mean, when the first ones came through, I mean, some of the people were fine. There was not a real problem. But there were some instances where there was some discrimination. One of the things was the Canadian government really didn't have a barrier for Black immigrants coming to Canada. So where there were some elements that started to get upset and they said, well, they didn't want them here. I don't know if they thought they would get some of the unrest and strife that they saw in the States, or whether they just didn't like having somebody look different in their area. There was a pushback. It probably came to a peak about 1911 when some of the boards of trade across Alberta, particularly the Edmonton Board of Trade, made a big push asking that the federal government put severe restrictions on Black immigration to Alberta. And actually, there was an order of council prepared by the federal government that would have done that, except it was never proclaimed. So there weren't the formal barriers, there were unofficial barriers. You had to have so much money to come across the border. You had to provide various guarantees and things like that. So there were a number of quiet rules to try and keep down the immigration, but we never had an outright law that said, you're black, you can't come to Canada.
So putting the adults aside for just a moment here, Michael, how much racism did a black child face growing up in Alberta?
Well, again, I think it depended on how things were happening. Actually, when a lot of the first black colonies were started up here in Alberta, there was one at Keystone or Breton, Wildwood, Campsie, and the biggest one was at Amber Valley, not far from Athabasca. They were fairly remote areas, and that wasn't really by accident. One was that's where there was available homestead land, but also given some of the very harsh and bitter treatment and conditions a lot of these people had faced in their lifetime, they were a bit wary. So they picked places where they would be a bit removed from other people and hopefully then have less conflict.
Did we ever see any kind of segregation taking place in our province?
Not formal. We didn't have some of the really strict outright laws that other places had, but unofficially, I guess what I could say is there weren't laws that discriminated so much, but there also weren't laws that said it was illegal to discriminate. That didn't come till the 60s and early 70s. So if someone chose not to rent you an apartment, it wasn't illegal. And there was that kind of soft racism and discrimination and segregation that happened, but there wasn't a law that said black people can't live in this neighborhood, they have to live in that neighborhood, or they can't get on a bus or anything like that.
So what was the response from the First Nations population to welcoming black newcomers?
Actually, probably a little bit of, well, I don't know, they hadn't really seen people like that before, or there weren't a lot of them. As I say, the odd fur trader and a few black cowboys. I think when they saw them, one thing they were probably struck with most was that they talked like white people. A lot of them acted a lot like white people. They just thought they were rather different looking white people. So I don't think there was any overt hostilities, but there was probably a little bit of curiosity and wonderment about who were these different looking people that were coming across the border. But I've never saw anything that recorded about the First Nations responding badly to any of these people coming into Alberta.
You know, it's interesting too. I have friends that are blonde haired, blue eyes. They go over to China, and when they go to remote villages, remote areas of China, a lot of the Chinese kids are fascinated. They want to touch the hair, they want to touch the person, because they've never really seen anybody quite like that before. So it's interesting, right?
Yeah, and I think it's very, very similar kind of things. I know when you look at some of the early fur trade records, when they have a black fur trader come in, let's say with the Hudson Bay Company or the Northwest Company, when they went in, they said they would often be a subject of a lot of fascination and curiosity because, well, who is this kind of person?
Now, I understand there were certain politicians who were very outspoken against black immigrants. Can you share a bit of that?
Well, a lot of that came from, there were people, as I say, the Edmonton Board of Trade, unfortunately, seemed to be one of the hotspots for that, but there were others. And, you know, they often didn't really come out and say, well, we hate black people or we're against, but they would say, well, you know, they won't be able to handle our winter weather, or they won't. Now, as people that have lived through a winter in Oklahoma and Kansas, I think that would have been surprised that you're not used to very cold weather, because of course they get it there just as much as we get it here. But so it would often be couched in that way. Well, you know, it would really be for their own good. You know, they won't fit in well. They won't do well with our climate. And quite the opposite was true. I mean, these people went to areas where they started homesteads, often in the country, and started reasonably successful farms. Actually, the rate of successful homestead among the black settlers was higher than it was for a lot of other people.
Now, I understand the early black community sometimes got a community church started where they settled?
Yeah. A lot of them, when they came, they were Methodist or Baptist, but there was a sort of evangelical one called the Standard Church of America. It started in some of the agriculture communities, but it really thrived in places like Calgary, where there was more an urban black population, but sort of a very evangelical, very energetic kind of Christianity. And the churches became community centers, much as you find in the United States. A lot of the black community is very much tied to their church communities, and so they were very key parts of the early settlements.
So, Michael, what kinds of protection did Canadian and provincial law provide for blacks way back in the 1800s?
Well, actually, there really wasn't. A lot of the protections started, well, Mr. Diefenbaker brought in the Canadian Charter of Rights in the early 60s. A lot more laws came in the late 60s, early 70s. Mr. Lougheed brought in, laws in the early 70s, anti-discrimination laws, which really did. We had the Human Rights Commission formed. So a lot of that really has come in, whereas it used to be there weren't laws that discriminated, there weren't laws that prevented discrimination. In the last 40, 45 years, we've seen a shift to where there's more proactive legislation trying to make sure that we don't have discriminatory laws. And that's certainly improved the situation. Also, a lot of it too is in the last 40 years with immigration patterns, Alberta has become much more diverse than it once was. Whereas there were 27 blacks appear on the Alberta census in 1901, now there's thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands. And my experience has been when there are people that you see all the time that you get to know, they become your friends, you see a lot less discrimination. It's hard. You can demonize somebody you really don't know much about. It's harder when it is somebody you know.
Now, can you share a little bit about the history of one of Alberta's early black cowboys who apparently introduced longhorn cattle to our province?
Well, I'm not sure about the longhorn cattle part, but certainly John Ware, he was a former slave. He'd been in the Carolinas. He went out to Texas and the American Midwest as a cowboy and eventually made his way up into Alberta in the 1880s. Very skilled horseman, very good with cattle, very hard worker, very highly respected. Worked very hard, was able to start his own ranch, first of all, not that far from Calgary at Ship Creek, but later on down in the Brooks country, and really was a very highly respected man, got married, had kids. Tragedy though, his wife, 1905, his wife got sick and passed away. He was left a widower, and then that fall, his horse tripped through him and he was killed in the accident. And so his kids were left as orphans, and his in-laws, the Lewises, then raised the kids. But when he died, very highly respected, a lot of tributes made to him as a man that people knew, a man that people respected for his skills, his integrity, and has become kind of a symbol of a lot of the really good things for the early black Albertans.
So how did the Great Depression of the 1930s really affect the black population?
Yeah, you actually saw the number of blacks in Alberta in those years decline somewhat. A lot of them moved to other parts of North America looking for work, just as a lot of people all across Alberta and Western Canada moved around looking for work. Blacks weren't any different. It wasn't until the boom years following the Second World War that you started to see new ones coming back to Alberta or new multi-generation families, because by this time, some of the people that had come in the turn of the last century, I mean, now their children, their grandchildren, and now even occasionally their great-grandchildren have been their lives in Alberta for their entire lives.
When did we first start seeing blacks rising up to prominence in our society, be it political, business, education, or even in social circles?
Well, I think one of the first really notable ones was a woman by the name of Violet King. Her family were one of the founders of the Keystone Colony out by Breton. They then later moved to Calgary, Sunnyside Hillhurst, and she went to school, became a lawyer, and in 1954, when she was admitted to the bar, she became the first black woman lawyer, not just in Alberta, but in all of Canada. Really a remarkable person. Another really prominent Albertan reasons were through our football teams. I mean, there were some really outstanding Alberta football players who were Black, and they certainly became folk heroes and really a lot of real assets to our communities.
So, Michael, does Alberta have any museums or websites that highlight our Black cultural history?
Sure. One of the best places would go to the website of the Archive Society of Alberta. It's called Alberta on Record. It will give you all kinds of sources of information. It will tell you all kinds of archives across the province that have records. And also there's tens of thousands of photographs you can access through that site. But others, there's Glenbow in Calgary, there's the Galt in Lethbridge, which is a first-rate institution, Provincial Archives and Museum in Edmonton, but also community ones such as the one at Breton, where the Keystone Colony was. They have a lot of really good records and a lot of information that they're able to provide.
Lots of good resources. Michael Daw, Red Deer City Councillor and historian, thanks a lot for joining me today from Central Alberta.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great day.